The heat shimmered over the red dirt road, bending the air in wavering lines. Out beyond the church, the mesquite trees clung to the earth, their shadows thin and brittle in the midday sun. The sky was wide, unbroken, a pale wash that seemed to drain the color from anything beneath it. Wind came in soft fits, lifting grit into the air and laying it down again. On the church steps, where white paint peeled in curling strips, she stood with her back straight, bouquet clutched in her gloved hands. The lace at her wrists was damp, sticking to her skin. Inside the open doorway, the shadows of the pews lay in neat rows, but the aisle between them was empty. She had been there for an hour, maybe more. Time had a way of losing its edges when you were waiting for something that might not come. The old cedar boards creaked faintly when she shifted her weight. The bouquet's white blossoms trembled when the wind caught them, and she tightened her grip, as if by holding them still she could anchor herself. A horse should have appeared by now, its hooves striking against the road, its rider's shoulders squared beneath the sun. There should have been a voice calling her name. Instead, there was only the low hum of insects and the faint rasp of dust against the wood. She kept her gaze on the road anyway, refusing to look toward the small knot of townspeople gathered across the street. They weren't there to celebrate. She could feel their glances, could almost hear the muttered speculation. It would spread fast, whatever they decided had happened, faster than a prairie fire in August. Her stomach was tight, but her face betrayed nothing. She had learned long ago how to wear that kind of stillness. The truth was simple. She had agreed to marry a man younger than herself by 3 decades. It was not a decision she'd made lightly, but when a person lived long enough with silence, the promise of companionship, no matter its source, could take on the weight of necessity. He had courted her with eagerness and a kind of charming awkwardness, speaking of cattle drives and the far-off places he would take her. She had believed enough of it to stand here now, in a white dress that felt suddenly absurd against her skin. When the sound finally came, it wasn't hooves but footsteps, steady, unhurried, drawing closer. She turned and saw him, a tall man, broad-shouldered, dust on his boots, his hat held in one hand. Not the groom. His face was weathered, his hair sun-faded at the temples. His gaze met hers without intrusion, as though he knew the landscape of her humiliation and would not step too far into it without leave. "You've been stood up," he said, not cruelly, just stating the fact as if it were the weather. She tightened her jaw. "Seems so." He studied her for a moment longer, then said, "I'll marry you right now." The words landed between them without flourish, like an offer of work or the passing of a salt shaker at supper. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. His voice had the kind of calm that didn't invite mockery. "Why?" she asked. "Because you came here for a reason. Seems a shame to waste it." Something in her bristled, pride, maybe, or the instinct to guard herself from kindness she hadn't earned. She glanced over his shoulder. The onlookers were still there, pretending not to watch. A woman in a blue bonnet leaned toward another, whispering behind a gloved hand. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Elias McKenna," he replied. "I've got a ranch out past the northern ridge, a mile from the river. Been running it near 20 years. It would have been easy to laugh, to dismiss him, but his expression was steady. He didn't look like a man rescuing anyone. He looked like a man stating something true and letting her decide whether it mattered. She shook her head slightly. No. He didn't press. He settled his hat back onto his head, gave her a small nod, and stepped aside so she could pass. She walked past him, her boots striking the dry earth with more force than necessary. The air smelled faintly of mesquite smoke from some distant cooking fire. The street felt longer than usual. She kept her eyes on the ground, though she could feel glances skimming over her like grit in the wind. Outside the general store, the keeper paused in stacking tins of peaches to watch her go by. She thought she saw him murmur something to the woman at the counter. She kept walking until she reached the boarding house, its narrow porch shaded by sagging canvas awnings. Inside the air was cooler but stale. She climbed the stairs to her small room, the boards creaking in protest. The dress felt heavier with each step. When she shut the door, the quiet pressed close. She set the bouquet on the bed and sat beside it. The petals, flawless that morning, now bore faint brown bruises where her fingers had gripped too hard. She traced the edge of one until it fell away, landing like a scrap of lace on the quilt. The room held little: a trunk at the foot of the bed, a single chair, a washstand. She could feel the weight of all her possessions condensed into that small space, as though her life had been boiled down to what she could carry in 2 trips. She unlaced her gloves slowly, laying them flat on the quilt. Her mind kept circling back to Elias's offer, to the way he had stood there without fidgeting, without looking over his shoulder for witnesses. She couldn't tell if that steadiness was arrogance or respect. The hours stretched. Evening came in with a softening of the light. Somewhere downstairs, the landlady's voice rose, sharp with reprimand at some unseen lodger. The sound of it made her restless. She opened the window, leaning her elbows on the sill. The street was quiet now, the dust settled. And there he was. Elias stood at the hitching post outside the livery, tying down a rolled blanket and a sack of supplies onto his bay gelding. He didn't glance up, yet she had the sense he knew she was there. His movements were unhurried, each knot tied with care. When he was finished, he checked the cinched strap and patted the gelding's neck before stepping away. She watched until he disappeared down the road, the bay's hooves muffled in the dust. When night came, the wind picked up, rattling the single-pane window in its frame. She lay awake listening to it, feeling its thin fingers slip through the cracks. The sound was almost like knocking, insistent, steady. She rose before dawn, dressing not in the white gown, which now hung like a ghost on the back of the chair, but in her plainest work dress. She braided her hair quickly, tucked the ends under, and slipped her feet into scuffed boots. Outside, the street was still blue with the last of night. The air was cooler, holding the faint sweetness of sagebrush. A wagon rattled past, driven by a farmer headed for the early market. She walked to the well at the edge of town, carrying her empty pail. The pump squealed when she worked it, water splashing cold over her fingers. She lifted the pail and turned, and found him standing a few yards away. Elias tipped his hat in greeting but didn't approach. He leaned one arm against the fence post, his weight settled easily on one leg. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She kept her tone even, but something in her chest shifted, like the first give in frozen ground. He nodded once as if that were all the answer he needed. "If you decide you want to take me up on it," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." The words were plain but they landed heavy. She felt them echo as she walked back toward the boarding house, the pail's handle biting into her fingers. At her window later, she saw the sun rise over the ridge, turning the dust into gold. The dress still hung over the chair, the bouquet lay crumpled on the quilt, petals scattered like small moons. She thought of the steadiness in his voice, the way he had offered without demand. What would it mean, she wondered, to be chosen without having to plead for it? Her gaze lingered on the road where he had walked away yesterday. It stretched toward the northern ridge, the place where the horizon blurred into distance. She didn't know yet if she would follow it, but for the first time since the church doors had stayed empty, the thought didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a door she could open when she was ready. And that, she knew, was worth keeping. The days after the failed wedding moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of small-town life, yet she felt them differently now. Each hour seemed to hold an awareness of him, Elias McKenna, as though his presence had taken root in the edges of her mind. She saw him at the market one morning, his arms full of feed sacks, his hat brim low over his eyes. He nodded once in passing, a gesture without flourish, but it lingered with her for the rest of the day. He didn't speak to her unless there was cause, and when there was, it was always plain talk. Questions about the weather, whether the well pump at the boarding house was still making that squeal, or if she'd seen any sign of coyotes near the edge of town. It was not what the gossips expected. The ones who had been so eager to watch her fall from the altar now whispered about a rancher with his eye on her. She heard their voices at the bakery counter, sharp with amusement. 30 years younger and ready to tie himself to her? She must have some trick left. The words were pitched low, but not so low she couldn't catch them. She paid for her loaf and left without a word, but outside, her grip tightened around the paper wrapping until she could feel the crust of the bread giving under her fingers. Their voices followed her down the street in her memory, sticking like burrs in the hem of her thoughts. She avoided looking for him after that, though she still caught sight of him in the periphery of her days. Once, she returned from the well to find the boarding house gate swinging silently on newly oiled hinges. The landlady claimed she didn't know who had fixed it, but the work was careful, the kind of handiwork that belonged to someone who valued quiet solutions. Late in the week, a dust storm blew in without warning. One moment the sky was pale, the air dry, the wind steady. The next, a wall of grit rolled over the horizon like a living thing. She was at her window, wrestling the warped frame to close it, when a shadow appeared on the porch. Elias stepped into view, his kerchief pulled over his mouth, his eyes narrowed against the sting of the wind. "Let me," he said, crossing the room without waiting for an invitation. He shoved the window down, secured the latch, then handed her the kerchief. "For the dust," he added, his voice muffled. She pressed the cloth over her nose and mouth, breathing in the faint scent of leather and sagebrush. When the wind died, they stood for a moment in the muffled quiet, the boards of the building still trembling under the last sighs of the storm. He didn't move toward the door immediately, but neither did he make himself at home. Instead, he leaned one shoulder against the frame, his hat low over his brow. "Still think I was joking," he said evenly, "about marrying you?" The question wasn't a challenge. It was something closer to an invitation, though not one dressed in ribbons or urgency. She didn't answer right away. Her pulse was still uneven from the storm, but now it beat against a different kind of weather entirely. "You hardly know me," she said finally. "I know enough," he replied. "Enough to think we do just fine." She looked at him, trying to read what he wasn't saying. His gaze didn't flinch from hers, and in that steadiness she saw no hunger for scandal, no need to prove himself. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. After he left, she sat by the window, the kerchief still in her lap, the smell of him faint but persistent. She thought of the years behind her, years lived quietly, politely, without complaint. She thought of how quickly the town's opinion had shifted from curiosity to condemnation, and how it might shift again if she accepted him. She told herself she didn't care what they thought, but she knew it wasn't entirely true. The voices carried in the narrow streets, in the stores and along the churchyard, and even the strongest pride had its soft places. That night she took the wedding dress from its box. She didn't put it on. She laid it out on the bed, smoothing the creases with a hand that felt unsteady. The fabric no longer looked like promise, it looked like memory and not a kind one. She folded it slowly, set it back in the box, and placed the crumpled bouquet on top. The flowers had dried, their color dulled, their petals brittle. She closed the lid with a quiet finality, as though sealing away a version of herself she no longer wished to keep in reach. Days turned into a week, and she noticed something she hadn't before: how often he was simply there when something needed doing. She never saw him approach with tools or rope in hand, but a fence post leaning in the wind would be straightened by morning. A loose shutter on the church would be rehung after a night of creaking. Once, at the market, she reached for a sack of flour too heavy for her arms, and before she could decide whether to leave it, his hand was there, lifting it easily onto her shoulder. He didn't offer conversation, just a nod before turning to his own errands. The restraint in him was puzzling. She was used to men who filled silence with noise, who tried to stake their claim through chatter or show. Elias was different. He seemed to understand that trust was grown in the spaces between words. Still, the town's scrutiny was constant. One afternoon she overheard the storekeeper talking to a customer. "Mark my words, he'll change his mind once he realizes what he's signing up for. It's a long life, saddled to someone who's already lived most of hers." She left without buying what she'd come for. The words pressed against her ribcage all evening. In the quiet of her room, she turned them over, wondering if there was truth in them. Elias didn't seem like a man who acted without thought, but she couldn't shake the fear that he might wake one morning and see her as they did, less a woman than a cautionary tale. It was near dusk when she saw him again, walking his horse through the main street. The air was cooling, the dust settling low. He stopped when he saw her, one hand resting on the gelding's neck. "You've been keeping to yourself," he said. "Some things are easier that way," she replied. His gaze held hers for a moment. "Maybe. But sometimes easier ain't better." Before she could answer, he mounted and rode on, the horse's hooves striking a steady rhythm that carried long after they'd gone. That night, she lay awake, turning over the memory of his voice, its steadiness, its lack of demand. She had been alone for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like for someone to offer something without asking her to bend herself into the shape they wanted. The next morning she saw him from her window, standing near the well, speaking with the blacksmith. He laughed at something the man said, a low, genuine sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep. She realized she'd never heard him laugh before. The days grew hotter, the sky stretching cloudless and pale. She went about her tasks, but found her eyes drawn more often to the road leading out toward the northern ridge. She imagined the land he'd described, grass running down to the river, the house weathered but solid. She wondered how he lived out there, alone but not lonely. It was in the market, late in the week, that she found herself standing beside him at the counter. He was buying nails and lamp oil. She had a small sack of coffee beans. The storekeeper, who had never been subtle, glanced between them. "You two doing business together?" he asked, voice edged with implication. Elias didn't look at the man. "Not yet," he said. "But maybe soon." Her heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. She said nothing, only paid for her coffee and left. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of rain on distant soil. She stood for a moment under the awning, listening to the faint roll of thunder somewhere far beyond the ridge. By evening, clouds gathered low and heavy. The rain came in a thin, steady sheet, darkening the dust until it smelled of earth and roots. She sat by the window watching it blur the outlines of the street. In the wavering light, she thought about the life she'd been living, a narrow path worn smooth by habit, and the one Elias seemed to be offering, its shape uncertain but its edges steady. The rain eased before nightfall, leaving the street dark and glistening. She lit a single lamp, its glow soft against the walls. For a long while she sat in its circle, the kerchief from the dust storm folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn edge. She didn't know what she would say if he asked again. But she knew that the question no longer felt like a stranger's intrusion. It felt like something that had been set down carefully in front of her, waiting for her to decide whether it was worth keeping. When she finally stood to put the lamp out, she glanced once more at the road. The night had closed in over it, but she could picture its path in her mind, winding toward the ridge and the quiet house beyond. The image stayed with her as she lay down, the sound of the rain's memory soft against the roof, and somewhere in it, the faint rhythm of hooves that might come closer one day. She slept with the window open, the air cool on her face, the scent of sage and wet earth drifting in. And though she told herself she had made no decision, her dreams carried her past the edge of town, over the ridge, to a place where the river's voice was steady and a single lamp burned in a window, waiting. The summer heat had deepened by the time trouble came, the kind that slid in quiet before showing its teeth. She had gone to the general store for flour and lamp oil, moving through the dusty aisle with the careful detachment she'd cultivated in town. Outside, the street shimmered in the light, its boards creaking under the weight of the day. She was halfway to the door when a shadow fell across her path. 3 men stood there, strangers by the look of them, drifters with coats too heavy for the season, their eyes restless and searching. One leaned against the doorframe, his grin thin and crooked. "Afternoon, ma'am," he drawled, though there was nothing polite in the way his gaze swept over her. She angled to pass, but the man shifted just enough to block her way. The air between them smelled of sweat and old tobacco. "Don't be in such a hurry," another said, stepping closer. "Word around here is you're still looking for a groom. Could be your lucky day." Her grip on the flower tightened. She kept her voice even. "Move." The man laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Feisty. I like that." His hand twitched as though he might reach for her arm. Before he could, a voice cut through the air, low, steady, threaded with steel. "That's far enough." Elias stood a few feet away, one hand resting easy at his hip, though the set of his shoulders said there was nothing casual in his stance. His gaze was fixed on the man blocking her path. "Step aside," he said. The first man's grin faltered, but he didn't move right away. "We're just talking." "Then you won't mind doing it somewhere else," Elias replied, his voice so calm it left no room for argument. A long moment passed. Then the man shifted, letting her through. She stepped onto the boardwalk, Elias falling into stride beside her without a word. Behind them, the drifters muttered, but none followed. They walked in silence until they reached the end of the street. She stopped, her pulse still high, and turned toward him. "Thank you," she said, the words heavier than they seemed. He shook his head. "Didn't do anything you couldn't have done yourself." "That's not true." He met her gaze. "You shouldn't have to." Something in her chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of what he'd said, and what he hadn't. The following Sunday the town gathered outside the church, the air filled with the mingled scents of dust and sun-warmed pine. The incident at the store had already found its way into every conversation, embroidered and exaggerated until it sounded like a near duel. She could feel the shift in the whispers now, they were no longer only about her. Throwing himself away. She'll ruin him. Doesn't he know better? Elias stood apart, near the edge of the churchyard, his hat brim shading his eyes. He spoke to no one, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. She watched him for a long moment, the tension in her shoulders coiling tighter. She thought of the weeks since the empty church door, the quiet ways he had made himself present without pressing, the steadiness he offered without asking for anything in return. She thought of how quickly the town had turned its attention on him now, and how he bore it as if it were no heavier than the sun on his back. Before she realized she had moved, she was crossing the yard. The conversations around her faltered, eyes turning to follow. Elias saw her coming but didn't step toward her, letting her close the space on her own. "If your offer still stands," she said, her voice carrying more than she intended, "I'll take it." The air seemed to tighten. A ripple passed through the onlookers like wind through tall grass. Elias's expression didn't change, but there was a depth in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Then we'll go to the preacher now." There was no ceremony in his tone, No swell of drama, just certainty. They walked side by side down the main street, her arm brushing his, the space between them no longer a gulf but a narrow, steady line. The crowd followed at a distance, curiosity tethering them. Inside the church, the light fell in pale shafts through the high windows, dust motes spinning lazily in the air. It was the same aisle she had walked weeks ago, but this time there was no hollow echo ahead of her. Elias stood beside her at the altar, his hat set neatly on the front pew, his hand warm over hers. The preacher, caught between surprise and the town's collective gaze, cleared his throat and began. There were no flowers, no music, only the sound of words spoken with weight. When it came time for him to answer, Elias didn't hesitate. "I will," he said, as though speaking to the whole of her life, not just the moment. Her own voice felt strange in her throat, but steady. "I will." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and for a beat there was only silence. Then Elias took her hand again, not squeezing, just holding it as they turned to leave. The crowd outside shifted, some murmuring approval, others holding their tongues. They didn't linger. The walk to his horse was unhurried. He helped her into the saddle without comment, then swung up behind her, his presence solid and grounding. The town receded behind them, its noise fading into the hum of insects and the creak of leather. The land opened wide as they rode, the sky stretching in all directions. She could feel the rhythm of the horse under them, steady as a heartbeat. Neither spoke for a long time. When the house came into view, a weathered structure set against the line of the river, she felt something in her loosen. The place was plain, the porch boards worn smooth, but it stood solid against the wind. He dismounted first, then offered his hand to help her down. "This is yours now," he said simply. The words were not grand, but they rooted deep. Inside, the rooms were clean but spare. A single lamp stood on the table, its base scratched from years of use. The window over the sink looked out toward the river, where the light caught on the water's surface in shifting silver. That night, the wind moved through the grass outside, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. She stood on the porch, hair loose, looking over the land. There was no part of her waiting for someone to arrive anymore. She was already where she meant to be. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of Elias humming, low, steady, the rhythm of a man at peace. She touched the kerchief he'd once given her, now folded in her pocket, and let the sound settle around her. The sky was deep with stars, the river's voice steady in the dark. She thought of the church steps, the empty road, the choice made in the open street. She thought of how still he had stood when she approached him, letting her decide without reaching to pull her closer. Now, the door that had been half open for so long was shut, not against the world, but against the emptiness she'd carried. And in its place was a quiet that felt like home. The night held them both, the air cool, the ground steady beneath their feet. Somewhere out in the dark, the horse shifted in its stall, the sound soft against the hum of the crickets. She breathed in, and for the first time in years the breath didn't catch halfway. It was a small thing, but it was hers. And it would be enough.